The British Are Coming by Rick Atkinson. The British Are Coming is an exquisite masterpiece of history by one of the nation's foremost writers and historians. This volume embraces the lived experiences of the war's early years with all of its complexities, ironies, triumphs, and tragedies. Atkinson's acclaimed trilogy of the United States Army in World War II and his experiences alongside David Petraeus in Iraq have afforded him broader insights into the challenges faced by 18th century armies. As one of the first Georgian Paper Fellows, Atkinson's stunning overture on King George III in 1773 sets the tone for the entirety of the volume. Multiple perspectives incorporate free and enslaved African Americans, French Canadians, Native Americans, Loyalists, and British combatants. He moves beyond a mere narrative of the war's battles and campaigns in America as a broader geographical and cultural fabric of the Revolutionary War unfolds. Above all, he movingly captures the humanity and inhumanity of the war's varied combatants, challenging mythologies along the way. George Washington looms large, and Atkinson's portrait of his evolution as the vital leader of the revolutionary movement is as masterful as it gets.
I've written about war my entire professional life, first as a journalist and a war correspondent, and then as the author of 7 nonfiction books on 5 different American wars. I spent almost 15 years researching and writing what I called the Liberation Trilogy, a narrative history about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II, in North Africa, Italy, and then Western Europe. When I finished that undertaking and pondered what to do next, I have to say that the American Revolution beckoned loudly. Our national creation story has fascinated me since I was a kid. After writing so much about our army of the 20th and 21st centuries, it seemed fitting to explore the origins of that army, those who created it, those who fought for it, and those who led it. And even more compelling to me, the American Revolution speaks directly to us about the most fundamental questions. Who are we? What do we believe? What were we the people, willing to die for? The American Revolution is one of the greatest stories in Western civilization, with characters and events and drama beyond the capacity of even the greatest novelist to invent. For a narrative writer like me, it's a wonderful opportunity to write unsentimental, meticulously researched history as a great yarn. In The British Are Coming, I wanted to tell the story of the first couple of years of the revolution from both sides, with sympathy and rigor, to portray King George III, his ministers, and his generals as vividly as George Washington and his compatriots. The brutality of the war still astonishes me. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war that anticipates the Civil War. The revolution shows us, and this should be comforting, that our nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. And it also shows us that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with grit, wisdom, and grace. And it reminds us that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils before, existential perils. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries, in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But to me, those forebears, those rebels remain nearer than we know.
Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home by Richard Bell. Richard Bell brings vivid new detail to what he identifies as the reverse Underground Railroad. These illicit networks seized free African Americans and spirited them away to the rapidly expanding slave markets in the Cotton South. Bell relays this history through the story of 5 teenage boys tricked into captivity on the docks of Philadelphia by a network of slave takers from Maryland's eastern shore. He traces the boys' harrowing odyssey from Philadelphia to Virginia to Alabama. With efficiency, skill, and complete mastery of his subject, Bell shares the ordeal of the kidnapped children. He details their fears, exile, and ultimate redemption as documented from surviving records of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Riveting and unforgettable, Stolen exposes a hidden story of fundamental importance to the history of race and slavery in the New Republic.
I wrote this new book, Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, because I had begun finding things in the archives that I could not explain. When I began work on this project almost 10 years ago, I began finding case after case of free African-American adults and children living in free cities like New York, like Boston, like Philadelphia, who were being targeted by gangs of professional people snatchers who made their livings turning free African-Americans into Southern slaves, selling them to planters, setting up in the Cotton Kingdom, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in Alabama, case after case after case. I had no idea this had happened on such a grand scale in the decades after the Revolution. And so I set out to write a book to educate myself about this kidnapping network, which in the book I call the Reverse Underground Railroad, and to share my findings with as many readers as possible. And I've chosen to focus this book on one particular case, the case of 5 free boys living in Philadelphia who in 1825 were kidnapped, were shipped out of the city of brotherly love by one of these gangs of professional human traffickers and kidnappers, and made to march on foot a journey of 2 million human steps from this region, the Mid-Atlantic, Philadelphia, Maryland, Delaware, down to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, where their captors tried to sell them as slaves. Fortunately, everything went wrong for those captors, and some of these boys were able to make, as my book subtitle tells us, an astonishing odyssey home.
The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President by Matthew R. Costello. This book is a rich examination of the process of memory making. In this case, the struggle to shape the nation's memory of its first president. It documents the emergence of genteel profiteering around the memory of George Washington. This includes the rise of historical tourism, the selling of the idea of Washington as a man of the people, as well by African American storytellers, and finally, the emergence of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and their guardianship of Mount Vernon. Costello provides a rich context for each phase of the battle over how Washington would be remembered. His book covers the political intrigue of the early republic, America's growing sectionalism, the transportation revolution that made historical tourism possible, and the concerted effort to adapt Washington's image to match the growth of democratic culture in America. This is a fascinating study, well written and persuasively argued.
So part of the inspiration for this book for me, it began early at a young age when I first visited Mount Vernon many years ago. And I wandered away from Washington during my academic career, but I eventually ended up coming back to Mount Vernon because I was really interested in memory and how Americans construct memory, how they deliberately create memory, but also forget certain elements of our history. It's all part of that memory-making process. And even though, today it seems like there's much of a consensus about who Washington was, the things he contributed to our country, during most of the 19th century, there were many different groups of Americans who fought to claim Washington for themselves. Whether it was his family, the Freemasons, politicians, enslaved and free African Americans, women, later with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, there were all these different groups of Americans who really believed that they had a right to claim Washington and act as the guardians on behalf of his legacy. And I think with Washington, it's a result of what I call in the book a democratization of memory. And what I think is so timely with this is that we were periodically moving through different episodes, political crises, conflicts, wars, and even now, a reckoning with systemic racism and injustice, and taking a much harder look at people like Washington and the founders and, what is the proper way to commemorate? What is the right way to remember? And I think what this book does is it shows you that this has been a long unfolding process. and that Washington's legacy very much is written by the man himself, but how we interpret it, how we represent it, is something that changes over time.
Heirs of an Honored Name: The Decline of the Addams Family and the Rise of Modern America by Douglas Edgerton. Few American families have left as much of a mark over so many decades as the Addams family. In this enthralling epic saga, Edgerton traces how John Adams' descendants carried some of his highest values, as well as some of his personality flaws, into the 19th century. As Edgerton reminds us, John Quincy Adams was ambivalent about race. He championed African American rights, but could not support the idea of racial social equality. The next generation felt uncomfortable and even alien in the world emerging around them. Edgerton is in full command of his subjects, capturing each of them as individuals who carried the burden of their progenitors' fame. The author acknowledges both their use and their squandering of their talents and does not excuse their faults. By the third generation, the Adamses took refuge in racism and anti-Semitism. In explaining this decline, Edgerton provides a powerful picture of the tensions that came with the modernizing of America.
There were several things that led me to write a book about the third and fourth generation of the Addams family. Primarily, I think they've been unfairly neglected by history and by historians. Every 10 years, there's a new biography of John Quincy Adams. Recently, a great book on the presidencies of John Quincy Adams. But the last book on Charles Francis Sr. was more than 50 years old. And of course, Charles Francis was the third Adams to be the ambassador to England, selected by Lincoln and William Henry Seward. He was there longer than his father or grandfather. He was there for 7 years. Almost single-handedly kept Britain from siding with the Confederacy. He knew when to be tough. He knew when to almost threaten war. He knew when to back off and smooth over some of Seward's more incendiary demands. And then, of course, his sons led Black troops during the war. His son Henry essentially invented the profession of history. So a really important family. The second thing is they were not America's first political dynasty. During their lifetime, they were the only political dynasty. Of all the early American presidents, only John Quincy, and Martin Van Buren had sons who lived to adulthood. So whenever there was an opening for office in Massachusetts, some editor would say it's got to be an Adams. When Charles Francis Sr. Was first elected to the state assembly in 1840, that made papers all across the country. And the assumption was he would go from being a state assemblyman to a U.S. senator, maybe a governor, and become the third President Adams. And why that didn't happen is really the point of my book.
World of Trouble: A Philadelphia Quaker Family's Journey Through the American Revolution by Richard Godbeer. In A World of Trouble, Richard Godbeer retrieves the experience of a prominent Philadelphia Quaker during the tumultuous years of the American Revolution. He draws upon the substantial collection of papers left by Henry and Elizabeth Drinker, beginning with their marriage in 1761, and follows them over the next half-century. He captures their ambitions, uncertainties, confusion, losses, and ultimately their hope. Along the way, Godbeer sheds new light on Philadelphia under British occupation and the shifting meanings of allegiance and loyalty in times of crisis. He provides a window into the pursuit of economic opportunity, the management of dependent kin, and the supervision of household labor. Written with sympathy, sensitivity, and a keen emotional intelligence, A World of Trouble offers a new and compelling portrait of life as lived during the Revolutionary era.
I wanted to tell the familiar story of the American Revolution from an unfamiliar perspective, inviting readers to think about the Revolution in new ways. World of Trouble is about a Quaker couple called Elizabeth and Henry Drinker, who, because of their pacifist beliefs, refused to side with either the Patriots or the Loyalists in the Revolutionary War, and paid a heavy price for that neutrality. By focusing on one family, I also hoped to give readers an intimate, human perspective on the Revolutionary era that a more general narrative cannot capture. I wanted readers to see how public and private worlds overlapped, as the political became painfully personal. When we look back into the late 18th century, it can seem a period of historic achievement. Yet for the people who lived through that era and faced multiple upheavals in their everyday lives, the experience often seemed more traumatic than triumphant. I wanted my readers to understand how unsettling and frightening it was to live through that period of history. The story that I tell in this book is one of survival and moral fortitude, but also of unnecessary suffering. So much of the suffering that took place during the Revolutionary era was due to people assuming that they knew what others believed, often incorrectly, and then demonizing those with different views. Quakers agreed with patriot complaints against the British government, even though they refused to fight in the war. Yet the Patriots refused to take what Quakers said at face value and insisted that their pacifism was a cloak for loyalism. Then, as now, some people claimed to have a monopoly on what it meant to be a true American, rejecting the possibility that others who disagreed with them might be honorable and in their own way sincerely patriotic. This story resonates powerfully with our situation today and provides a sobering reminder of what can happen when people listen only to their own fears and preconceptions instead of trying to understand what others actually believe and working to find common ground with them.
A Crisis of Peace: George Washington, the Newburgh Conspiracy, and the Fate of the American Revolution by David Head. A Crisis of Peace presents a vivid narrative of the Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783. It represents the finest account we have of the critical phase of the Revolutionary War following the Siege of Yorktown. Head's lively narrative thrusts the reader into Philadelphia taverns, Continental soldiers' huts at Newburgh, and the headquarters of Generals Washington and Gates, who were managing the army in the waning year of the war. Intriguingly, he deflates the notion of any Newburgh conspiracy in 1783. Head argues there is little evidence of a conspiracy where army officers were plotting to use military force to coerce Congress into paying their salaries or pensions. Instead, he suggests there was a chain of misunderstandings and accidental timing occasioned by rash and uncoordinated communication by officers that violated the chain of command and provoked Washington's intervention. Even if events at Newburgh contained far less danger of military coup than we've traditionally believed, Head nonetheless puts Washington's astute political leadership front and center throughout this gripping and important book.
Well, what intrigued me at first to the story of the Newburgh Conspiracy was the realization that this was a kind of Founding Fathers mystery. It wasn't exactly clear what had taken place along the Hudson River in March of 1783, when possibly the officers were poised to rebel against their leaders in the army and maybe against their civilian leaders in the Continental Congress. I looked for more information. I looked for what scholarship existed on the story, and I found that the latest scholarship was from the early 1970s. Well, that's a long time ago now. And so I thought that if I looked into this, I might solve the mystery, or at the very least, I could tell the story anew and find something fresh and different about what had happened during that pivotal event at the end of the American Revolution. Another thing that attracted me to the story was that it took place during the very end of the American Revolution. There's a kind of weird 2-year period that ensues after the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown in the fall of 1781. It's another 2 years until the fall of 1783 before the final peace treaty arrives and we have the real lasting peace. But I always wondered, what was it like to live during that period? What was life like? What challenges were faced? How do you go about daily living when there's not peace, but there's not really war either? You're kind of stuck in between. So that had always fascinated me as something that I usually skipped over as a teacher, going right into the Articles of Confederation and the story of the Constitution. But those 2 years of people living, not knowing what the final outcome of the war would be. So I was really happy that I was able to tell that story, talk about the challenges that were faced at the very end of the American Revolution, how Washington and other leaders met those challenges, and how they brought the revolution to a successful, peaceful conclusion at its very end.
The Widow Washington, The Life of Mary Washington by Martha Saxton. This is a beautifully written, well-researched revisionist study of the relationship between Mary Ball Washington and her son George. Saxton adds much-needed complexity to a relationship often painted as one between an uncaring and demanding mother and a dutiful son. Saxton challenges this unflattering interpretation of Mary Ball Washington as cold and greedy. In the process, she reveals the difficulties facing widows and mothers even among the 18th century's elites. Mary emerges as a three-dimensional figure who, though orphaned at a young age, ultimately marries an older man and enters Virginia's fabled planter society. 11 years later, she's a widow deprived of most of her husband's property by colonial law and struggling to raise 5 children. George never understood the fears of poverty and helplessness that continued throughout her life. He dismissed them as imaginary and manipulative. Yet Mary had a significant influence on her son, passing down many of the moral and religious principles that marked his adult life. Demonstrating how both struggled with their emotions and with their fierce sense of duty to family, Saxton shows how alike mother and son truly were.
I first encountered Mary and George Washington when George was complaining about having to give her money, which I thought was odd because he was an honorable man and also very rich. So I found it a little stingy of him. But what really inspired me to write the book were the various portraits of Mary. When I dug a little deeper, she's been, described as everything from a saint to a horrible, illiterate, nasty, dirty old woman. And I just couldn't reconcile any of this with what little I knew about her, and none of this was based on much or any evidence. So that's what really drove me to try and give her back a life that was neither idealized nor, the product of malice. In terms of the takeaway from this book, I think, the astonishing thing about the two of them is how much they were alike. They had very similar experiences in some ways as children. Both early lost parents. Both had to struggle financially early to help their families out. And both of them owned slaves from very early, so they became commanders in a sense. George and his mother ended up both very independent, both very hardworking, both persistent, never gave up on anything easily, both quite tight-fisted, both great horse people, great talent there, and both lovers of gardens, and in many ways just fiercely self-reliant. I think that those traits, many of them look much better on a man, even now, and certainly in the 18th century than they look on a woman. And so that may account for some of the malice directed toward Mary.